Hello, so welcome to this Bookseller webinar supported by CPI Books. This discussion is about the small presses. As defined by the Bookseller for its British Book Awards, it is for publishers with turnover of less than £1 million, is how we define small presses. So a distinct group slightly below the sort of independent level of the likes of Faber and Profile and Canongate. And often they are supported by the public purse, either through Arts Council England or through other arts councils across the nation of the UK. So we, back in May, after conversations with Spread the Word, it became very clear that small presses were being uniquely impacted by coronavirus in a way that the bigger publishers clearly weren't. And we heard this week that Bloomsbury's print book sales actually rose 9% during the sort of key lockdown period in a way that most small presses sales did not. And the reasons for that was because they are predominantly print-based publishers. They are very heavily reliant on high street bookstores, which were, for most of that period, were closed. And they are very heavily reliant on events-driven sales. And obviously events couldn't happen during that period too. So they were, we thought, uniquely impacted by the lockdown. And so we did a survey, and the survey came back to confirm what we already thought, which was that I think 60% of small presses thought their futures were now under jeopardy, both in the short term, i.e. for the next 3 months, but also in the longer term, looking into 2021. Some of that situation has been alleviated. Arts Council England did a magnificent job of spreading its emergency funding around to many small presses. And when that money came through, Nathan Connolly from Dead Ink Books in Liverpool said that the Arts Council had basically saved independent publishing in Britain. Certainly at this level it had. And, you know, Arts Council England does support brilliantly, I think, this level of publisher. So the situation was helped by that, and also has been helped since the middle of June by the opening of bookstores, although many events are still not happening, and therefore, you know, small presses are still struggling to get word of mouth out of their book releases. So this discussion is less about what happened during the lockdown and more about what happens next for these publishers. Will they emerge fully formed and trading on all cylinders post lockdown and with bookshops back trading again, or will the situation carry on and will they still need support? So as mentioned, our small press award at the British Book Awards, which we announced at the end of June, won this year by Jacaranda Books, is supported by CPI Books. And before this begins, we've got Andy Howarth, who's sales manager at CPI, to give us a few words and background of what he's seeing in the marketplace as a printer. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much for letting us on. Congratulations to Jacaranda. It was difficult choosing from the entries that we had. Took a long time, but it's good to know it's still a robust side of the business, and it's something that we do like to help. In fact, we get so many people who just come in and say, we're thinking of starting a publishing company. We think you're too big for us, which is not the case. But it happens frequently. In fact, it happened last week. We had somebody ring up again who's going to start or attempt to start a new publishing company. So good luck to all those people. We have to sort of go back a little bit, because when the lockdown started, things were kind of desperate for manufacturing companies, because we saw things sort of literally drop off the edge of a cliff. And to be able to enable ourselves to carry on, it was important that we worked with all our customers, but in particular, we had to work with the big customers. If we didn't work with the big customers and the big customers didn't work with us, then quite frankly, there'd be nothing for the smaller customers or any customers to do now, because we would. The way we did this after furloughing was literally say to the big clients, and for this, it's our 4 or 5 big, the Bloomsbury's, the HarperCollins and such, that what we needed was a certain amount of business to keep us going through those weeks. And quite frankly, they're obliged. And by doing that, we were able to continue and keep producing and keep the presses turning, knowing that we'd get to the end of it and we'd survive, which at the beginning of it, we obviously would, in trepidation, we didn't know what was going to happen. At the same time as that was happening, my responsibility for everything that comes into the business and for a lot of the small companies was to get in touch with them, threefold really. One, to obviously reach out to them and find out whether they were surviving okay, whether everyone was okay. So the first question was, we hope, you know, everybody in the business is fine. And the second was just to tell them that we were in business. We were actually printing books, and if people needed books printing at that time, we could manufacture them. What came back was, we'd love to print them, but how are we going to pay for them? Now that's a difficult one because we don't have bottomless pockets, but with a lot of companies and with a lot of small companies, we know there is cash flow issues. You know, nobody gets revenues from retail that quick. Whatever terms you get from us, you're probably not getting the same terms from the retailers. So there's always that imbalance with money. But when we knew that this was a possibility, then with some of them, when they came and asked us, we just said, well, look, pay what you can. And we know when we come out of this, you'll pay the balance. So with one or two of the customers who did come to us and say, we prefer to keep printing, we need to keep printing, we'd like to get these books published, and then we're ready for going, we were able to help. I'm not saying we can do that with everybody, but when we have a discussion with small publishers, we realize that the issues that they face are immense when it comes to the finance side of things. And we do try and help as much as we can to give them really what they require to keep going. The main issue that obviously they couldn't sell books. So again, and a lot of the distributors were running on different times. The other thing that we were able to do with people who were having problems at that time is store for them. We have storage facilities. So anybody who wanted books printed and stored, we could do. So we were doing our best in that particular time to keep things going for our small customers, as well as being helped invaluably by the larger ones to be able to keep the whole thing going, so that we knew when we came out of this, we'd still have a business to go back to people with and say, hey, you know, we're now actually running on full tilt. And within literally days of things starting to open, we had been saying to small clients, if you are thinking of printing, for goodness sake, try and get your files in as quickly as possible, because when this lockdown sort of gets released, things we assume will take off. And boy, did it. I mean, our orders went through the roof, absolutely through the roof. We have a capacity of 2.5 million paperback units a week and about 350 hardbacks. We were seeing orders in the first couple of weeks well in excess of that. Luckily, they've slowed down a bit now, but we're still at that sort of capacity. But that, even if they're small publishers, medium-sized publishers, large publishers, the same applies. When your files come in, they're just slotted in at the same time. Schedules are the same. Quality is the same. Service is the same. Nothing changes. So whether you're a large press or a small press with a book to produce, we're back and we're ready to help now.
So Andy, just as a quick follow-up, you're seeing now levels of ordering and printing that were similar to pre-lockdown, or ahead, or slightly behind. How's that working out?
Probably similar to pre-lockdown.
Okay.
Similar to pre-lockdown. I mean, it goes in cycles. The problem that we have is that one week we'll have a meeting on a Monday morning, our regular Monday update. They'll say, this was the order intake for this week, and we know we're full. So then the conversation we're having with clients is trying to see whether or not we can push dates back, whether or not we can pull dates forward. the next week we'll find the order intake goes down, and obviously there'll be a mad panic within the company. Are we going to get any more, as the business disappeared? But we all know that over the course of the time, it sort of evens itself out. Nobody who goes into print business expects to get 2,500 units every week. Some weeks you're going to get 3 million, some weeks you're going to get 1.5. It's the nature of the business. It's managing those peaks and troughs.
Yeah, and you're finding that's true of smaller publishers as well as bigger publishers, or are the bigger publishers able to kind of hoard all that printing time that you've got?
And nobody gets preference. Preference only comes when the files arrive. So you might be whoever, and if you send in you can't ring up and say, I've got 100 titles coming in next week. We want 100 files to come in, and once those files have come in, then that's when they schedule. So any small publisher with a book to produce, if that file is ready and that comes in, that will be scheduled in, and the delivery date that they've asked for, if we can do it, we'll do it.
Okay.
The thing that is always the unknown is the reprints. We never know what's going to happen with reprints. So you could have a week when it's big. But again, with reprints, whether you're large or small, if you're a small publisher and you've got a book that's doing well, we will endeavour to get that book turned around and back into the shops as quickly as possible. We'd be foolish to give them different delivery dates. It's a book that's doing well. So whether you're Jacaranda or whether you're Bloomsbury, if that book comes in and it's selling well and you need a reprint back into your warehouse within 7 days, then we'll attempt to do it, because that's selling well for a reason. If we don't deliver it in, something else will suddenly take over.
Yeah,
and
okay.
that book will die.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to turn to the publishers now and get their views on the market as they see it. But thank you for that overview from CPI, and thank you for your support for the Small Press Award. I think it really is a new and really rich part of the British Book Awards, but also part of what we do. I mean, before we kicked off, I think someone said that having the small presses really makes their lives a bit more interesting. I feel the same way for the Bookseller, really. Having those small presses in the magazine and featuring their titles just makes the magazine more interesting because of the sort of diverse nature of the books that we therefore see. So thank you, Andy, and thanks for all that support. So I'm going to introduce our panelists now for today. One is struggling to get on via their Wi-Fi connection, but hopefully Kevin Duffy from Bluemoose is out there in the ether somewhere and trying to plug something in or get the phone socket to work, and will join us shortly. But I will introduce you to the panelists in the meantime. So we've got Cherise Lopes-Baker, commissioning editor and manager of fiction for Jacaranda Books, and she's standing in for Valerie Brandis, who is the founder of Jacaranda. And if you saw Valerie's valedictory speech and video at the Nibbies, it was hard to kind of keep a dry eye as regards what that award meant for them and meant for Jacaranda, who were, at the beginning of lockdown and from 2019 onwards, really, really motoring, and we're really having a kind of just a brilliant year, and hopefully this won't have sideswipe them too much. There were obviously Jacaranda was one part of the Inclusive Indies crowdfunder, which as we all know, raised, I think, more than £150,000 for Jacaranda, Knightsob, and other diverse publishers. So that was a fantastic result of the struggles that we'd seen in the small press market. And then on my screen below her is Lindsey Mooney, who is one of the co-founders of digital publisher Hera Books. So she no doubt will have a completely different perspective, not having all those tricky issues of
well, no, I do. We do print as well.
You do print as well, but not having all of those issues around high street bookstores and printing and stocking books, and having a strong digital business has obviously proved to be vital for some of the bigger publishers. So we will, I'm looking forward to hearing from Lindsey. And then above her on my screen at least is Sarah Crown, who is Director of Literature for Arts Council England, who I've already mentioned have done magnificent work. I think the best work I've ever seen from Arts Council England in terms of rising to the challenge and funding some of those small presses, and having that sort of 50 million, I think it was 50 million earmarked for the literature sector was just, well, you know, it saved it really, and I think we cannot underestimate what that has meant for those publishers and the overall market. So, Lindsey, I'm going to start off with you because your view is going to be slightly different from others. So, tell us about your lockdown and how it's changed your Hera book.
Well, aside from being stuck in my flat on my own, which has been driving me crazy, we were having our best ever months before lockdown, and April was probably our biggest month ever. I mean, we're only 2 years old, so that's to be expected. Although we had a lot of print orders that were cancelled, or orders are expecting. So generally we work on a special sales model. So we get firm sale orders from booksellers. So because we can't afford to put loads of money into print. And when bookshops closed, obviously that kind of changed things for us a lot. I think the biggest difference for us, I'm possibly seeing a slight plateau in sales because all the big publishers who didn't actually care about digital until, you know, and I know that I had worked with them at Kobo, I know exactly how they work and how they look down on ebook sales. They're now putting a lot of money into that when bookshops closed. So for us, if you look at, certainly in a lot of the digital bestseller charts, it's big brand name authors who are discounting heavily. So, I mean, it's quite hard to compete against that. And God knows how long that will go on for. So I don't know, it's hard to, there's a lot of uncertainty. And when you're self-funded, that's quite hard.
What's the shape of your business? I mean, are you what percentage are you digital sales and what percentage are you print sales? And how has that changed during the lockdown?
We're probably, I would say, 90% print sales. A lot of what we earn is also in rights. So kind of working with audio publishers and publishers abroad. So I think most of our orders that we were expecting to come in print-wise over the summer were delayed or cancelled, and we had to stop printing books. I mean, we work with Canelo, who do most of our print stuff anyway, so thankfully that didn't affect us too badly. But this month, you know, the trajectory that we were on hasn't quite, we're not kind of doubling sales every month like we were before.
And how has that changed? How is that changing your approach to commissioning?
I don't think it's really changed our approach to commissioning. So if anything, we've still got a massive pile of submissions that you'd think we'd have more time to read. I think everyone's struggling with concentration and everything at the moment. I think we definitely need to make sure that every book we commission is going to sell, because we can't, much as it needs to sell, it needs to make back its money, and we're probably being slightly more ruthless with our commissioning, because, you know, much as we may absolutely adore a book, if we know there isn't a commercial market for it, you know, we can't necessarily take a bit of a punt anymore.
And does it matter, does it change your approach if, for example, Waterstones has all its stores open, or if it doesn't, or are you?
We're very commercial, and Waterstones probably don't take a lot of our books.
Yeah.
So I mean, they do, but not. I mean, it's more just going into the hub. We're not likely to get a bulk order from Waterstones. So the Works and other places that would buy firm sale, yes, that does change things for us.
Yes. Cherise, I'll bring you in here. At Jacaranda, you obviously saw during the beginning of the lockdown a drastic downturn in business, which prompted Valerie to launch the Inclusive Indies crowdfunder. But how has it changed in the sort of past month or so as bookshops have come back on stream, and I guess the possibility of doing outreach events with authors has improved?
Um, I would say that obviously bookstores opening is helping. But I think because we don't know, how long bookstores are going to stay open, if there's going to be a second lockdown, it looks unlikely that we're going to have physical events anytime soon. We're continuing with what we did at the beginning of this lockdown, which was pivoting to digital. So having digital events and digital launches and, discount codes during that to try and push sales in a similar way that we did in physical events. And investing in our own digital bookstore, and really trying to almost invest in ourselves as a way to safeguard for the future and just as a strategy moving forwards.
And is it changing, similar question to Lindsey, is it changing what you are thinking about publishing or commissioning or the formats that you're planning on using?
Sorry, is this one for me or for?
Yeah, sorry, you again, Cherise.
Where I think because of what we've been through and what we're what the inclusive indies and ACE has been alleviating, we still have to be quite cautious with our commissioning. So we are still commissioning, we're commissioning the same books that we would be, the same topics, the same kind of authors. We're not trying to cut out any type of topic or voice. I think just the number might be reduced, and we'll probably be leaning on paperback more than hardback. But we went through a period at the beginning of lockdown where we had to pause our acquisitions, and right now we're kind of coming back from that, and it's been amazing to get back to some authors I've been holding off on and actually be able to give them that offer. But yeah, I think Jacaranda's focus and lists are going to look the same. It just might be slightly reduced in number for the next year.
And Sarah, turning to you for a sort of overview from Arts Council England, what did you see back in the early stages of the lockdown that concerned you, particularly about the publishers you were already engaged with, but also the wider landscape?
So I think what when all of this kicked off, what we tried to do at the Arts Council was take an overview of the whole literature sector and what the threats were to it, and where the kind of real vulnerabilities were, and look at it kind of rather than initially thinking about individual organizations, obviously many of whom we have a relationship with and care about very deeply. We tried to sort of view it in more structural terms and think, what are the things that we really can't do without? Imagine if this lasts for 6 months, imagine if it lasts for a year. When we get to the other side of it, what do we need to make sure we still have in order that the whole literary ecology is able to continue to function? And it's sort of, it's worth kind of noting, I think, that, within the Arts Council, my focus is on literature, and it was noted that literature as a sector was less sort of dramatically and desperately impacted by the lockdown than, say, the performing arts sector. So that was, that it was an important context for me internally, because it meant that I had to be really kind of clear about the case that I was making for where we needed to put our support. And so we thought about this a lot, and there were clearly elements of the literature sector that we felt were robust and resilient and would be able to kind of ride out a crisis of this sort. So the big publishers, for example, we know, they have a very, very broad base. They have, real depth of publishing, which allows them to kind of sustain themselves. There were parts of the sector that we thought were critical and were critically at risk, but were sort of slightly without our remit for reasons of state aid and things like that. So bookshops. And we work very closely with Merrill Hall at the Booksellers Association to talk to the government about the importance of reopening bookshops to allow things to keep, to start flowing again within the literature sector. But we weren't involved in directly funding bookshops, because that's an area which is sort of without our scope. And so it seemed to us that really, when you're looking at across the piece, the area or the kind of the stratum of the literature sector that was both really vulnerable and really critical to the kind of overall health of the ecology, not just now, but in the future, were small presses. And that was where we felt we could really make a difference. So we, and our thinking around that kind of goes back. It's not just about the, you know, COVID and the impact of COVID. It's that we've been doing a lot of thinking for several years now, probably from the point at which we published a report in 2017 on the state of literary fiction in the UK, which is now a term that I really kind of wish we hadn't used, because it feels that that's very limiting and not necessarily helpful, and wouldn't be the angle that we go into it now, I don't think. But when we looked at that, you know, there was a lot of problems, there were a lot of threat, there were issues around the number of people who were reading and the kind of drop off of sales and books, and, you know, sort of particularly in fiction. But the real bright spot were the small presses, who have kind of emerged and have, you know, been a really kind of invigorating force. They're really critical when it comes to things like diversity and inclusivity, regional diversity. They're distributed across the country in a way that the major publishers aren't, and in a way that I think we're now seeing major publishers begin to respond to and move outside of London themselves. You know, they take risks that the bigger publishers sort of sometimes don't want to take, and they're experimental in the types of book they publish. And so what we felt was that, you know, if we find ourselves in a situation at the other side of this crisis where there are still books, there are still readers, there are still writers, but we've lost this kind of really critically important tranche of publishers who are doing so much in terms of research and development, in terms of bringing new voices to the fore, we've really, you know, we've made a real mistake, and we've lost something really essential. And so it's, you know, not to kind of bore everyone senseless with the intricacies of Arts Council grant making, which I can do it another time if anybody is really interested, but all of those grants are given an area, and within art forms, I don't have a budget myself, and I'm not the one who's making those decisions. But we were able to make a very clear case across the whole of Arts Council and all of the areas that we operate, that it was our view that in terms of literature organisations, small presses were critically important, and we felt we needed to commit to supporting them as far as possible. And so that was sort of where we got to. And I think now we're thinking, you know, we've not that we're out of the woods, but we have passed through the initial crisis and all of the points that people have made around a second lockdown, bookshops closing again, the jeopardy that would create. These are real, and they're urgent questions. You'll probably be aware that there is a cultural recovery fund which the government has created, which Arts Council is involved in distributing or administering, one of those two words. And we're sort of looking at, that's going to be focused on organisations, and we're looking at what the criteria and the guidance for that fund will be. But I think
1.7
billion, yeah.
Yeah. So the literature sector will get a portion of that. Do you know yet what that portion is, or do you have to make the case?
So the way that it works is that there won't be a specific chunk of it committed to literature, because the Arts Council just sort of doesn't operate in that way. What will happen is that the Arts Council will get a tranche of that money to distribute alongside other organisations like the BFI and National Lottery Heritage Fund and organisations such as that, and the other arts councils as well, obviously in other countries. And then it's all, you know, applications will come into us, and we will send the money out. But we don't kind of divide it up by art form, so it would be about making the individual cases again. But again, we would want to kind of give some advice as a literature team on where the focus should be. But I think what we're also thinking about is what's the long-term picture here? What are we going to see when we get through to, let's say, this time next year, when it feels reasonable to hope that we might be in a more stable position, and that business, or, you know, some sort of return to kind of normal business feels not too much to hope for by that point. And I think probably one of the things that has happened is that it has speeded up our thinking and our relationship with small presses around the country. And where traditionally what we've done is we've tended to support small presses with a kind of specific remit, so poetry or short fiction or a particular audience, like People Tree Press, for example. I think that we want to sort of evolve our thinking around that, and I would be really glad to see more small presses applying to us to be part of our national portfolio.
How many do you have at the moment?
Oh God, that's a killer question, isn't it? I'll have to add up on my fingers. Around between 10 and a dozen, I think, and I'm now covered in shame that I don't know the exact number. I'm going around the areas and trying to count them up.
When we did a Small Press Award, I wasn't sure how many applications we get, but we got, I think, 40 odd in the first year and 45 in the second, and getting, I would say getting stronger and stronger. So although Jacaranda won, there were probably half a dozen others that could have won in another year. And I think Jacaranda were actually a joint winner in London with Tiny Owl, because their submission was also equally strong. So, it's an area that's growing both in vibrancy, but I would say, without being rude to anybody, historically, but also professionalism, which I think is helped by the fact that the market is part digital. Printing is obviously easier to get there. It's POD now. There are easier routes to customers. So it's a growing area. Sarah, I just got another question, which is, does it make it tricky having those conversations within Arts Council, that publishing is such a sort of bifurcated industry, and that there are the giants like Hachette and HarperCollins and Bloomsbury, which has clearly had a decent COVID in the sense that sales have not fallen off a cliff, and in some cases they've risen, and then you've got the really little people like Jacaranda or Bluemoose, that where sales just stopped overnight. Is it hard to make that conversation? Because I'm guessing it's not the same in other art sectors. I mean, theatre doesn't have big companies that can, and they won't have been able to trade through the lockdown because they just haven't been able to put on shows. So it's very clear how that industry art form is suffering, whereas in publishing you do get mixed messages.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think probably the most important part of my job within the Arts Council in that sense is being clear about the fact that the Arts Council traditionally, literature was probably the last art form, I think, to be added to the group of art forms that the Arts Council covers. And we haven't, as an Arts Council, traditionally had much of a relationship with the big publishers and with the kind of the commercial publishing sector and the commercial book selling sector as well, because it has been viewed as something that is separate, not in terms of the work that it does, but in terms of the scale at which it's working. And if you think about other art forms, I mean, there's absolutely a commercial sector to the theatre world. For example, you have a lot of commercial theatres that will put on big commercial hits and shows and musicals, things like that, which wouldn't necessarily be the sort of work that we would fund as an Arts Council. But the relationship between the commercial and the publicly funded bits of those art forms is well understood. So we get that there is a traffic backwards and forwards, and that there'll be people who train in publicly funded move into commercial, or vice versa, and that there's absolutely kind of a two-way flow. And I think that part of what I've been trying to sort of elucidate since I've been at the Arts Council is that the same is absolutely true of literature. It's just that we haven't necessarily seen it in those terms, or quite as vividly in those terms to date. And we have, in the last, I think the easiest way in which it's been possible for us to broker that conversation and to kind of advance that understanding within the Arts Council, but also actually within the sector itself, within commercial publishing, is to talk in terms of readers and readerships and the need to develop, sort of reading as an activity, readerships, groups of people around the country, and as sort of potential buyers down the line. And once you begin thinking about audience, you then realize that we're all doing the same thing. We're all involved in the same industry here, and there is that kind of cross current backwards and forwards in terms of resources being shared. You have an author, Kevin. I think Kevin's on now, but the example that I often reach for is Ben Myers, who Kevin published many years. Sort of it's astonishing success with. Winning the Walter Scott Prize back in 2017, and hope that I've got that right. And then Ben has now moved on. He's at Bloomsbury, but Bluemoose still has his back. That sort of crossing backwards and forwards feels really important and really healthy. And that's something that we want to kind of continue to support, and that's the kind of the nature of the case that we've been making internally, I think. And
it happens all the time, particularly if you take into account writer development agencies as well, who are doing lots of the sort of background R&D with writers, and it's not often acknowledged. In fact, the Ben Myers deal with Bloomsbury, which I think put some money back into Kevin's pocket is highly unusual. And I think Kevin has spoken about this a lot, about the idea of sort of transfer fees between small presses and big publishers, and agents tend not to like that idea. But somehow I think the big publishers do need to step up and accept that there is a sort of there is an R&D exercise that the small presses are doing that the bigger publishers benefit from. And
Mate, one last point on that, and then I'll shut up because I know we're sort of short on time. One of the, you don't want to, it feels crass and unhelpful to be talking about benefits or opportunities from this crisis, because we're still in it, B, it's been disastrous and sort of personally devastating for many people. But I think that from my perspective, watching it just from, purely from a structural literature point of view, one of the things that has been really positive about it is that the literature sector has understood in a way that it has never had to understand before how deeply interconnected and interdependent it is.
Yeah.
And that is something that I hope we can all build on coming off the back of it. And it supports the conversations that we would want to have going forward about the fact that we all need to, we're all on the same team, we're all looking out for each other. It may, there are degrees of competition within that, but that's the kind of the healthy competition of a healthy ecosystem. It's not, we're not kind of locked in battle with one another. We all depend on one another. You develop a reader and they will go on and buy books from every different publisher, not just from one. And I think that really has been made very clear by the last few months.
Just to say to any attendees, you're welcome to add questions into the chat forum, which will be on your screen somewhere, or indeed the Q&A section, which we can respond to. Kevin, I can see your name, but we're not sure whether your audio is working. Can you give it a go quickly? Well, I would definitely hear Kevin if he was speaking and his audio was working, so I can't. So we'll assume that he's still working on that. Lindsey, there was a question from the floor straight away, which was directed at you, which was, you mentioned rights sales. And the question is, well, can you talk a little bit more about that and whether rights sales have changed, whether demand for those books has changed during the lockdown? Obviously, everyone's suffering financially, so I don't know
that it's changed. I think it was that's pretty much the same as certainly I was dealing with before, and where I am. Yeah.
And how do you handle rights sales then during this period? Is it all done via Zoom?
You know what? Well, especially, I don't think it's that different, because a lot of the publishers I'm dealing with might be in the States or anything else. So it's not really changed. I mean, to be honest, in terms of the structure of the way we deal with things, because Kesh, my business partner, actually lives in Essex, and I'm used to working remotely at Kobo. So to be honest, like a lot of the way we deal with it, I miss going into an office, definitely. But a lot of what we did was via email or video call anyway. So it hasn't really changed, aside from book fairs, the way we deal with rights.
And did the fact that London Book Fair didn't happen and at Frankfurt looks like it's going to be pretty much virtual? I
mean, it's mainly a social thing for me. Like, I don't really think. I mean, the meetings are good, but there's only so much you can get done in 30 minutes. I think it's better to have more in-depth meetings outside of the fair. It's good to maybe bump into people, and the serendipity of it is good. I mean, most of the best things that have come out of book fairs for me have been outside of the fair in a social setting where someone introduces you to someone. And I mean, that's the good value of it there. But in terms of actual meetings, no.
So in a sense, the lockdown has sort of finessed the way you do business and in some ways improved it.
Yeah, I mean, I do miss face-to-face. You always get more done with a face-to-face meeting. I mean, not necessarily at book fairs, just because they're so short. And I think it helps to be able to do something, to have meetings in person. And personally, I just like actually having a meeting with someone, and sitting inside my flat 24 hours a day isn't great for productivity, I think. But that's me. I think a lot of people are being more productive. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's it.
And Cherise, what does I mean, tell us about the Jacaranda sort of office situation first, because there's a question here about recruitment. But I'm guessing most small presses are not heavily into the recruitment business, because they're mainly kind of 1 or 2 per people operations, often run by the founders. But tell us about how Jacaranda operates, whether you've got an office or whether you're working from home now, and also, you know, what you expect to be doing in the near future.
So we had an office. There are about 5 core members of Jacaranda. We had an office and we meet there most days of the week, although that could change throughout the year. You know, we have had quite flexible working from home experiences. So it wasn't a massive infrastructure change to switch to fully working from home during this lockdown. But it has brought up questions of, you know, what do we do after this? We haven't figured it out yet, whether we, you know, go back to the office we have, whether we look for a different office space. Like it's honestly still up in the air right now.
How has it impacted the way you go about doing your business? Because speaking to some of the bigger publishers, they found that the day-to-day business runs perfectly well, but some of the creative side, the sort of creative friction you get from being in the same room together, from exchanging, you know, just conversation around certain subjects, that's gone missing, and they worry that will affect commissioning longer term.
Yeah, it's interesting because the office space is obviously great for building teamwork and community, and you really do miss out on that. We have like a weekly team meeting where we all gather, and that's as much as we sometimes catch up with each other. And yeah, we were just talking the other day about how much we're looking forward to the day when we can actually see each other and have a proper catch up. At the same time, for me personally, the bulk of my work is editing, and that's best done at home alone anyways. So productively speaking, great working from home. I think I've been almost more productive in some respects, but yeah, at the cost of having that community and teamwork around, which.
And during the sort of inclusive indies period where you were raising money and that fund was sort of starting to build and build, that must have been a frenetic period for everybody, and one of major, you know, ups and downs, and, you know, a range of different emotions. I mean, what was that like to experience?
It's been really, so at the beginning when we were in crisis, we'd all been reduced to 2 days a week. And some of us are still part-time. And there was a lot of uncertainty, like almost existential uncertainty of Jacaranda. And even when we kind of started the inclusive indies, it only gained so much traction. And then tragically, I think it was the death of George Floyd, and the kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter at that point in time that drew more attention to that fundraising. And it's something that we feel very conflicted by, because obviously, like, we're not here to profit off that, and we are also hoping that, like, the people supporting us because of that will continue to, and we're really just here to platform that community. So we're glad that we exist to continue to do that, but, you know, obviously hope that it's not, we have kind of more reliable support and like a commitment that it's a movement and not just a moment. And yeah, it's a lot of emotion around that.
Exactly right. And Kevin, I think your audio is working. Can you confirm this? Still no Kevin. So I'm going to come back to Sarah. When you're speaking to some of the small presses now in your sort of day to day, what are they thinking about the near term now? Are they hopeful that with bookshops back, with the clearly the learnings that we've had during this period, and the kind of agility that they've had to show, that they emerge out of it, you know, as Cherise said, in a sort of slightly better and more substantive shape. You think?
I think it. I suppose the first thing to say is that, of course, it varies, you know, very much from case to case. And another, I'm not sure if it's exactly an impact of COVID, but it was certainly hastened, I think, probably by COVID and by the lockdown. It's the closure of Bertram's, which I know that, you know, there's a bunch of small presses who, you know, perhaps felt that they'd weathered the initial storm of COVID, you know, either via you know, sort of support from their subscribers, or via the crowdfunder, or with some help from via funding from us. And then they get hit with a huge bill, an unpaid bill, which they then need to sort of make good on in terms of you know, Bertram's post collapse. So I think the concern, or my concern, is that small presses, you know, part of the reason why they're so innovative and so sort of you know, deft and dexterous is because they are kind of fleet of foot, and they don't have huge overheads. They can move around very quickly. They can make sort of speedy decisions. But that is the flip side of that is fragility. And their business models are always dependent on the next book, the sale of the next book, or the next 2 books, or even, you know, the next sort of 6 months worth of books. And when you kind of, you know, throw not just one curveball, but 2, and, you know, with potentially more, you know, to come, we don't know what asteroids are circling at the minute, then that fragility is going to be kind of amplified and backlit. And so I suppose, you know, having rambled, what I would say in conclusion is that I think what we are aware of is that we've got this far, but we just don't know. We just don't know, you know, what is going to happen next, and we need to be really alert and recognise that, you know, from our perspective, from the Arts Council's perspective, further emergency funding may be necessary. The initial sort of tranche of emergency funding that we distributed was about you know, sustainability to the end of September. So we were looking specifically at which are the organisations that are going to fall over, that we think are in sort of at risk of collapsing before the end of September. The end of September is just around the corner now, and we know that the next period, you know, from October to March, is going to be equally difficult for a number of small presses. And again, you know, there is that thing with publishing, which was one of the points that we also sort of sought to make internally, is that you don't necessarily see the impact of something that's happening now until 6 months down the line. So we needed, you know, that was something that I felt I personally had a huge responsibility to make clear to people who are not literature specialists within the Arts Council, you know, because they're specialists in other things, and that's great, but they might not necessarily be aware of the way in which publishing functions as a business, and the fact that, you know, there is costs and risk will be deferred, and you need to be thinking 6 months ahead and knowing what the risks are. So I think, you know, as I said earlier on, I think there are a lot of things to be hopeful about. I think we have recognised collectively, and this was happening before COVID-19, the really essential role that small presses play within our ecology, and the sort of disproportionate contributions they make to things like diversity and inclusivity, but also to prize lists. You know, for example, when you look at the way in which small presses are overrepresented on prize lists, and you can see the kind of the contribution they make in terms of, you know, art and greatness within literature. And what we need to be thinking about longer term, again, I think, is how do we help small presses move from the fragile business models that they're operating within currently to a more stable footing? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that those are the questions that we need to begin asking, you know, as we emerge from this crisis. And I think, you know, we're still very much in kind of emergency mode at the minute, and thinking about, you know, how are we going to get through the next few months, and what are the next things that we're going to have to contend with. But it's our responsibility, I think, to be starting to think about what the shape of the sector is going to be coming out of this, and how we make sure that we protect those things that are valuable. One
of the things that publishers say to me, smaller publishers, that even when they have funding to do the books, and when they have a book such as, you know, the Bluemoose book, Leonard and Hungry Paul, it's still extremely difficult to find shelf space. It's particularly promotional shelf space, so front of store, or window display, or visibility within a chain like Smith's. And Lindsey, back to you. You mentioned that publishers piling into ebooks more voraciously due to the lockdown had impacted that side of the business. I mean, do you see both angles, that you can't get books, as you mentioned, easily into Waterstones, which obviously impacts the print side of your business, but equally you can't get promotional space on ebook retailer websites?
There's a big
navigate
retailer that, yes, maybe won't deal with us and might deal with other publishers. Yeah, I mean, also we don't have the marketing budgets that the big publishers do, so it's actually quite hard to stand out. I mean, I'm lucky that a lot of, because we're mainly digital, there are other retailers that are supportive, but it's kind of hard to, now that the bigger publishers are putting all their energy behind ebooks, it's hard to gain more traction. I think also at the moment a lot of people are, you know, aren't spending money on things. A lot of people are struggling to focus, to read, and certainly a lot of, well, just anecdotally, a lot of friends I've spoken to just haven't read for ages because they're so anxious about the world. So, you know, yeah, it's, I'd be interested. I haven't looked at any stats about whether ebooks you probably know better than I do, Philip, whether ebooks sales have increased during lockdown.
Well, obviously we don't get the ebook sales data from.
Yeah, not from everyone.
Never tire of saying that. Amazon blocks us from knowing what's happening in the ebook market. But we do know anecdotally that, I think it was Bloomsbury this week that said their digital business was up something like 50% during lockdown.
Okay.
Which was a factor of 5 ahead of what its print business was up. So clearly ebooks are, digital generally is accelerating in a way that print books aren't. But Lindsey, is there a sort of sustainable model that you can see coming down the track where you do get space to do?
We do, and actually, you know, Waterstones have been tremendously supportive. But obviously, you know, they're a retailer. It needs to be books that work for them. Obviously, with other retailers, you need to pay for space, which isn't something that we can do as an indie, really. Yeah, I mean, print it's such a, again, we're kind of learning with print which of our titles work well in print and which don't. I mean, yeah, that's not really an answer. Sorry, I haven't had enough caffeine this morning.
Well, there's no obvious solution, is there, apart from bigger publishers to step aside and let some of these.
Well, yeah, and it's really hard. I mean, as Sarah was saying, I think we were on a route to just, our business was going so well, and now it's so precarious. You know, I don't know I'm trying to like model our business 6 months ahead. We've got a massive royalty bill coming off. And it's hard to know what's going to happen. I mean, I'd really like all the, now bookshops have opened, for the big 5 to stop pricing their ebooks so low, so we can get more volume. But yeah, I think it's changed the landscape quite a lot.
And Cherise, same question for you, but thinking about physical books in the general, do you perceive a sort of future where there is more space now within physical bookstores for the types of book that you're bringing out and promoting? Do you think that there has been a change in people's perception, not just of indies, but of, you know, inclusive indies in your case, who want to make bookshops a better space for everyone to buy books within? We heard with the Rethinking Diversity report that many people don't regard bookshops as an easy environment for them to find the books that reflect their world back at them, and yet that is clearly probably the best route for small presses to get their books out to those audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I know the reports come out every 10 years or so, and they say the same thing, and the cycle kind of continues, unfortunately. And I remember doing my own dissertation research and going into different bookstores and analyzing how many were diverse, and it was shocking. And that kind of environment, looking at, you know, the communities that come in and the disconnect between the communities that are going to the bookstores and the lack of books that reflect them. I'm hopeful. I'm perhaps a bit cynical, maybe not as cynical as people who've been in the industry longer, but also just very hopeful that like this could be the turning point. And I know that there's been a lot of conversation around committing to that change from booksellers, from you know, big publishers who are willing to kind of give advice or give a bit more access to their infrastructure and their resources, and kind of sharing that space with them in that kind of symbiotic relationship that Sarah touched on. For Jacaranda specifically, we're definitely going to try to do that. As Lindsey said, we don't really have, you know, big marketing budgets that can buy that space. We have to hope that people will want to give that space to the voices that we're publishing. But we're also, you know, as I said, investing in our own digital bookstore. We're investing in a space for ourselves, and hopefully not just for Jacaranda, but for other inclusive books who want and publishers that want to be on that, and kind of, you know, in the same ethos as small presses, creating spaces for ourselves, almost creating that kind of sales platform.
Yeah.
That people.
One of the publishers I spoke to right at the beginning was Wonderbly, which obviously sells direct off its website and does POD all over the world. And you know, one of the things we were discussing was whether that could work for small presses who often have brands that are very visible and well and very identifiable, and yet cannot always get those books in front of this kind of wider audience. So is there a sort of direct supplier route that is possible for maybe for a group of small presses or a group of indies to come together? It sounds similar to what you're working on at Jacaranda.
Yeah, very similar.
Do you think, just as a sort of wrapping up question, well, actually, there's a question from the floor. I'll ask you first, Cherise, which is about events. I mean, how is your business sustainable? Does it work in a sort of environment where we can't have author events? I mean, or do you really need those?
I mean
physical events, of course, not virtual.
Yeah. What we've we were, I don't know if I'd say dependent, but I guess, you know, they were a large portion of where we engage with our community were physical events. And we have had to pivot away from that. And we are kind of picking up in that respect, in that direction. Like, it's getting better, moving toward that digital focused direction, and kind of transforming all our publicity and marketing, promotion, and engagement in that way. And so we could conceivably continue in that direction should we have to, but I don't think we necessarily want to. I think that we really value directly engaging with our community at these events. So even if we could survive off not having them, I think we would still really want to.
Sarah, two sort of final questions for you. One is, because the pipeline is so important, you know, just publishing a book is only really half the job. You need to market it and publicize it and get it in front of people to buy it. Is the Arts Council going to look at that bit as well, rather than, because I know you're very focused on the sort of input at the moment, and perhaps, as you mentioned, less focused on the output. And also, do you talk to the bigger publishers about also, you know, that sort of symbiotic relationship that you've talked about, which is there but not often talked about, and I wouldn't say widely appreciated among the bigger publishers of the work done by smaller presses. So it could be better. And when you're talking to the bigger publishers, if you do you think there's a sort of recognition that they also need to step up? It can't all just come from public funding.
So to come to the first question first, which seems logical, I think, yeah, it's certainly something that we have thought about and talked about, although obviously, you know, it's important to sort of, you know, when we think about the kind of the way in which Arts Council works and the order in which things happen, we are led by the market, I suppose, to an extent. We you know, we respond to applications coming to us rather than going out and telling people, you know, what to do or how to apply or whatever. That said, we've absolutely had conversations around I think always with anything, and this sort of slightly goes back to the answer that I gave to the first question about how we thought about the literary ecology at the start of the pandemic. The thing that interests me most is not necessarily the individual interventions that we can make with individual organisations or authors, as important as those are, and as critical and ongoing as those will be, but more, you know, what can we do structurally? What are the bigger things that will make a difference structurally to the whole ecology and that will kind of lift everything up? And so I think one of the conversations that we've had is around, is there something that all small presses need that we could support, you know, across the piece, rather than saying, you know, we'll support each individual small press? What is the one thing that we could do that would support the structure of within which small presses operate? And certainly, you know, we've talked about you know, marketing is something that people have discussed, you know, have raised with us quite a lot, and that might be an area where a sort of an intervention at scale from us could actually make a difference, make more of a difference than a series of small interventions, which I think is often, you know, that feels to me to be the more kind of compelling and attractive proposition, if you can do something that helps everybody rather than, you know, helping people individually. Although
Kevin mentions that in France, Kevin's now DMing me privately on here, but he mentions that in France, their publishers signed up to giving 0.15% of their profits to a creative publishing pot.
like it.
I don't know whether looking at profit is the right thing, because profit is always very elusive in this business. Yeah. But well, really, publishers have become more profitable over the past decades, and they do support the industry in lots and lots of ways, not least, you know, through subscriptions and advertising and coming to the events of the bookseller. So it's not like they don't step up, but you do wonder whether there needs to be a sort of more explicit link through to some of the smaller presses.
So again, I think where we have been having this conversation with the bigger publishers, with whom we do now regularly speak, is, as I said earlier on, around readers and reader development, which feels like an area that everybody would benefit from. Again, looking at that, you know, what this sort of structural fix that will sort of support everybody. And also as an area in which big publishers are sort of comfortable with getting involved, that feels like it's sort of, it is sitting more within the territory of corporate social responsibility, I suppose, rather than sort of specifically looking at support for individual small presses. That's the conversation that we're having. But I do know, again, from conversations with publishers, with big publishers, which we've got much more into that space over the last couple of years. And when I mentioned earlier about a lot of them, I think looking at what small presses are doing, recognizing the strength of the small press scene in this country, and specifically recognizing, I think, probably regional diversity and what that can offer. So you're seeing a lot of big publishers now, you know, making proper concrete plans to begin to move outside of London. And again, that's something that I imagine that absolute sort of gravitational pull of London has been slightly broken up, I think, by the effect of COVID-19 and all of us working from home. I think those plans are real and are in train. And in a lot of the cases where we've seen big publishers having those conversations about moving to regional cities or to, you know, to core cities around the country, they've been doing that while having conversations with the small presses in those areas and looking at having a much more, you know, sort of a closer and more, oh God, I think there's a word from biology that I'm reaching for and I can't find it. So let's park that for now. mutually beneficial relationship where, you know, each can learn from each other. You know, there are things that big publishers can help small publishers with in terms of things like, I don't know, foreign rights or marketing, things like that. There are things that small publishers can help big publishers with in terms of local authors and local audiences, and supporting that cross-fertilization, I think, is something that we're really keen to do and have done to an extent in various different places.
Yeah, that regionality is really important to us too. I mean, we do a Welsh, Scottish, and Northern and Irish focus, and we've done them throughout the lockdown, and they've all been well supported by the publishers involved. And it's, as I said earlier, it just makes the Bookseller much more interesting when you've got a bunch of people setting up in Northern England or Wales or wherever, and they're publishing as well, if not better, than London-based publishers. And the struggle is not their professionalism or the books or the writers, it's just access to that wider audience that only, it would seem, the bigger publishers can get to. Cherise, I've got one question for you, which is from the floor, which is, if you're a new press about to set up specifically looking at diversity, should you jump in now or wait?
I would jump in now. I'm not sure that I would ever discourage someone from doing that. It's never been an easy time to start a diverse press. There are pros and cons to doing it now, which one, as I mentioned before, is, you know, there's a bit more attention to it right now. There's no guarantee how long that will last, but there is more conversation around the need for diversity. But you're, you know, on the other hand, you're also dealing with COVID. I think there's always going to be reasons not to, and there's always going to be reasons to, and you can look for the perfect time, but ultimately we need you. So.
Well, I would suspect much more competition for those writers, hopefully from the bigger publishers, but not you know, getting in the way of some of the smaller presses. Have you noticed that when you're commissioning, that there's the bigger publishers are now coming in for those writers?
You know, I think that there's still going for tried and true diverse authors. So perhaps not the same debut authors that, you know, myself and my colleagues are really looking at. But there are also cases of people coming from the big publishers who have been motivated by the current conversations and who have said, you know, actually, I'm not happy with diverse authors who aren't happy with their publishing experience at the big companies, who are now looking to move to the smaller ones, and motivated by the conversations that are happening right now. So yeah, it's give and take.
As ever, there's no easy answer. Lindsey, I'm going to come to you as a sort of final question. As a former retailer,
Yes.
A gatekeeper, if you like, what's your advice for small presses, or really any publishers trying to get space either within high street or within online booksellers? What's the secret sauce that Kobo would
about caring about the books, and it's all about the hand sell and being able to pitch passionately. I certainly, as a retailer, if someone told me about a book they absolutely loved, they stayed up all night reading and just had a really personal approach to it, that's the kind of thing that we really cared about. And even, you know, with us dealing with, because I'm now on the other side doing, I mean, admittedly pitching to my former colleagues as well, it is about that. And it's just about letting people know why you care about those books. And yeah, it's about loving something and yeah, pitching it in that way. I think generally, even with the big kind of retailers, if you can let them know that, then they can get behind something.
Just on a practical level, have the big retailers or even the smaller retailers, have they pivoted to allow you to pitch virtually?
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone has. I mean, with a lot of those people anyway, I give or take, I mean, some of them live near me, so I might, with my former Kobo colleague, go and do a socially distanced pitch in Clissold Park. Yeah, I think everyone's kind of adapted quite well to it. I mean, a lot of the right stuff I did anyway was over email, or video call. So yeah, I think pretty much, I think everyone's realised you can work from home and you can do these things, and I mean, it's great to be in an office just for the physical contact and actually to be able to bounce ideas off each other. But technically, there's no reason why you can't do everything online now.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I'm sorry that we couldn't get Kevin's internet connection working from Hebden Bridge. But I'm sure we'll come back and do this again probably after the summer to see what the market's doing, what it's changed, and we'll get Kevin back and make sure he's got the space within the Bookseller to articulate his views. Or if not, you can check him out on Twitter where he'll do that 24/7 for you. I'd like to thank the panelists that I did have, so Sarah, Cherise, and Lindsey, and before that Andy. And you know, for me, big up the small presses. They provide diversity, but also great interest and great impact, I think, now within the sector, both in terms of the authors that you're publishing and the publicity you're able to generate for those books. And you know, good luck for the next few months, and I'll see you on the other side. And thank you to the panelists for joining us today.